She was just scrubbing floors in the hotel until she answered the phone in clear Dutch. The hotel owner happened to hear it and called her into the office the next day. Subscribe. And where are you watching this video from? Write in the comments. The night air in San Francisco was thick with mist as the city slept under a blanket of low-hanging fog. Street lights flickered in silence, casting long, broken shadows onto sidewalks slick with dew. In a neighborhood far from the glossy skyline and sparkling high-rises, a single dim lamp lit a cramped third-floor apartment on Maple Street. Inside, the only sound came from a whisper, steady and rhythmic, repeating Korean verb conjugations with quiet determination. Gasta, gaseoyo, gasubnida, murmured Chaidada West, seated cross-legged on the floor beside a chipped coffee table that doubled as a desk. Her worn notebook, filled with neat columns of vocabulary and grammar notes in multiple languages, lay open beneath the yellow glow of the bulb. Her voice was low, careful, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts in the walls. A battered laptop beside her played a slow-paced Korean audiobook, paused every few sentences as Jada jotted down new words with a pencil chewed raw at the end. It was nearly 11 p.m. Her shift at the Sloan Grand Hotel began at midnight sharp, and she had just enough time to change clothes, pack her second-hand work shoes, and kiss her brothers goodnight before catching the last bus into the city. The apartment was silent now, both boys fast asleep in the room they shared, their limbs tangled beneath mismatched blankets. Jaida paused at the doorway, watching them with something like a mother's tenderness, though she was their sister, not their parent. Since the accident that had taken both their parents 3 years ago, she had become everything at once: provider, protector, teacher, and quiet warrior against a world that did not expect much of women like her. At 29, Jada had long since shed the luxury of complaint. Her life ran on grit, obligation, and whatever small scraps of hope she could gather between cleaning hotel suites and teaching 12-year-old Caleb algebra before bed. That night, she tucked the edges of the boys' blankets around their shoulders, gently turned off the fan, and whispered a promise into the dark. "We'll get there. One day." She said it every night. She didn't know if they believed her. She wasn't always sure she believed herself. But still, she said it. By 11:30, she was at the bus stop with her cleaning tote slung over one shoulder and her long black curls tucked into a tight bun beneath a hoodie. She avoided eye contact with the men on the corner and kept her head down. The bus came late, shuddering as it slowed to a stop, and she climbed aboard silently, tapping her transit card without looking at the driver. The Sloan Grand stood like a jewel in the city's crown, 15 stories of glass and golden limestone on the edge of Nob Hill. Lit up at night like something out of a fairy tale, it catered to the wealthiest travelers in the world. Celebrities, royalty, oil magnates, she'd seen them all from behind the veil of invisibility that came with her uniform. Her badge said Jaida, housekeeping, but in truth, her mind was always elsewhere. Tonight, as she swiped her ID and entered through the service entrance, the hallway lights buzzed faintly overhead. She changed in the staff locker room, trading her hoodie and jeans for a plain blue housekeeping tunic and soft-soled shoes. From her locker, she took out her earpiece and tucked it beneath her collar, her secret companion. Tonight's language was Hebrew. Tomorrow might be Russian, or Swahili, or perhaps Tagalog. She liked to work in silence. It made her feel like she didn't exist. Most nights, she moved like a shadow across marble floors, wiping down gold fixtures and rearranging furniture no one had touched. She wasn't supposed to speak to guests, wasn't supposed to look at them directly unless spoken to, And mostly she didn't. Until she had to. At 1:42 a.m., she was cleaning the lobby near the valet entrance when a tall German man stumbled inside. He looked lost and frustrated, pointing at a paper map while muttering rapidly in German. The night receptionist had stepped away, and the doorman was nowhere in sight. Jaida froze for a split second, instinct pulling her back. But the man looked truly distressed, and something in her resisted the urge to remain invisible. "Entschuldigen Sie, kann ich Ihnen helfen?" she asked softly, stepping closer. The man's face lit up, and he launched into a rapid explanation. He was looking for the garage, needed to get his rental car before it closed. Jaida listened patiently, nodded, and explained exactly where to go, pointing him toward the private access elevator. They spoke for less than a minute. Then he was gone, and she turned back to her cart. She never saw the man in the tailored charcoal coat standing by the tall ficus tree, watching the entire exchange with furrowed brows. Lucas Sloan had been walking through his lobby alone, something he hadn't done in months. He liked to inspect his properties in silence, watching them as guests might, looking for imperfections no one else noticed. But tonight, what caught his attention wasn't a design flaw or a scratch in the marble. It was a young woman in housekeeping uniform speaking fluent German with the ease of a diplomat. He didn't speak, didn't approach, just watched as she calmly resumed her cleaning, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Who was she? Back at her cart, Jaida reached for her cloth and resumed wiping down a glass panel. Her heartbeat had only just slowed when the earpiece in her ear clicked into life again. The audiobook resumed. She whispered the Hebrew translation of the last phrase she'd heard, trying to focus. This wasn't the first time she'd broken the rules to help a guest, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But tonight felt different, as if the air had shifted. She shook the thought away. After her shift ended at 8 a.m., she rode the bus back home, changed into jeans, and walked her youngest brother to school. She stopped at the corner bodega on the way home, picked up discount bread and milk, and returned to an apartment that still smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and old books. Her world had two faces, the opulence of Sloan Grand and the fading wallpaper of her real life. But between them, she had built something strong. Every evening, when her brothers finished their homework, Jaida would go to the kitchen table, plug in her laptop, and study. She was preparing to take her advanced proficiency test in Dutch, her 9th language. She loved the way it sounded, the rhythm of its structure. Her mentor, a retired linguistics professor from Rotterdam she met online years ago, often reminded her she had a gift. She liked to pretend that meant something. At the hotel, no one knew who she really was. Maybe that was a good thing. People didn't like women like her stepping out of place. But secrets, like talent, have a way of refusing to stay hidden. On her next shift, she was dusting the grand staircase when a guest asked for help in French. Without thinking, she answered. A bellhop nearby raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Later that night, she spoke Korean to a group of elderly tourists who had trouble understanding the front desk staff. Jaida thought nothing of it. She was just helping. But someone was watching. In an upper office with tinted windows, Lucas Sloan reviewed security footage for unrelated reasons and paused, twice, on clips where Jaida appeared. Each time she was solving a problem no one else could. Each time she vanished back into the shadows without credit or acknowledgement. Who was this woman? He instructed his assistant to pull her file. It was sparse, no college listed, only a GED, years of menial jobs, no red flags, no accolades either, just a name. Jada West. Hired 3 years ago. Steady, never late, requested night shifts only. He scrolled through camera logs. She appeared often near problem areas, but always alone, always silent, always competent. Something didn't add up. Elsewhere, Jada took her break in the staff lounge, reheating leftover rice and beans in a dented microwave. Her phone buzzed. It was an email from her Dutch tutor. "Congratulations. Your mock scores put you in the top 1%. I think you're ready." She smiled, eyes blurring for a second. It had taken 3 years of studying, stealing minutes between cleaning rooms to reach this level. She whispered a line in Dutch under her breath, savoring the sound. Outside the lounge, footsteps paused. Lucas Sloan listened through the partially open door, just long enough to hear the cadence of her Dutch. Confident, clear, native-level fluency. Not memorized phrases, not textbook recitation. He didn't enter. Not yet. But something had just changed. And for Jada West, the woman no one saw, the ground beneath her was about to shift in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. Jada's footsteps echoed softly through the polished back hallways of the Sloan Grand as she pushed her cleaning cart into the storage room. Her shift was nearly over, but something about the night clung to her skin like static. Unseen, but impossible to shake. The strange tension hadn't left her since the moment she'd helped the German guest near the lobby. It wasn't just the language, or the timing, or even the guest's smile of gratitude. It was the odd silence that had followed, the prickling sense that eyes had been on her long after she turned her back. She chalked it up to fatigue. She was used to invisibility, and when someone like her was noticed, it rarely meant anything good. In the dim morning light, she made her way back home, watching the city shift from night's hush to the groan of awakening traffic. Her eyes were heavy, her limbs aching in that dull, constant way she no longer paid attention to, but her mind was alert. On the bus, she reviewed flashcards in Swahili, mouthing the words to herself with practiced fluidity. It had become a ritual. Learning kept her grounded, sharp. It reminded her that her intellect still existed beneath the layers of uniform, fatigue, and anonymity. Back home, Caleb and Mason greeted her with sleepy voices and warm hugs. Jaida didn't let her exhaustion show. She helped them with breakfast, reviewed their spelling quizzes, and packed their lunches. Then she sent them off to school with a smile that wavered only when the door closed and silence fell again. She collapsed onto the couch and stared at the ceiling, eyes burning. For 3 years, this had been her rhythm. Nights spent scrubbing the floors of people who would never learn her name. Days filled with responsibility she hadn't asked for. But beneath it all pulsed the quiet insistence that she was not finished. Not yet. Meanwhile, high above the city in the private office suite of Sloan International's West Coast headquarters, Lucas Sloan sat before a spread of security footage, pausing on each clip where Jada appeared. He didn't normally involve himself in staff matters this far down the ladder. The Sloan Grand employed over 600 people. He knew perhaps 10 by name. But something about her voice had lodged itself in his memory like a melody half-remembered. He wasn't used to being curious. He was used to control, but curiosity had a sharp edge, and it cut through the layers of habit with disquieting ease. He leaned back in his chair and reviewed her employee file again. Name, Jada West. Age, 29. Position, night shift housekeeping. Hire date, 3 years prior. 0 write-ups. No commendations. No notable mentions. Just 3 solid years of silence. Her education history listed only a GED. No degrees, no certifications, no languages noted. That didn't match what he'd heard, what he'd seen, and Lucas hated inconsistencies. He tapped his pen against the edge of the desk, mind turning. Either the file was incomplete, or Jada was hiding something. But what? Elsewhere, Jada stood in line at the public library in Oakland, waiting to log on to one of the communal computers. She clutched a folder under her arm, filled with translations she'd printed from the week before. The computers only allowed 45 minutes per session, and she needed every second. She had been perfecting her application for the official Dutch proficiency exam. Her mentor in Rotterdam had reviewed her mock test and sent back a glowing review, along with a recommendation letter she hadn't dared open yet. She logged in, opened the PDF, and felt her throat tighten as she read his words. Miss Jada West demonstrates a fluency, intuition, and sensitivity to language that rivals many of my most gifted university students. Her linguistic instincts are extraordinary. I recommend her without hesitation. It should have been a moment of pride, but all Jada felt was panic. No one could ever know. There had been a time when she believed talent alone would carry her. She had been accepted into the University of Southern California's School of International Studies with a scholarship that made her mother cry with joy. She had been the first in her family to even consider leaving the state. But that was before the fire. Before the red lights, the smoke, and the endless court paperwork that followed. Before she learned that even dreams as bright as hers could be reduced to ash in the space of a night. She dropped out halfway through her second year just after her parents' funeral. There had been no choice. Caleb was only 7. Mason had just turned 5. The small savings they had left were drained in weeks. Jada had sold her textbooks, her laptop, even her bike. When a friend mentioned that the Sloan Grand was hiring night staff, no experience required, she didn't hesitate. She showed up in her only clean shirt and took the job with both hands. It was supposed to be temporary, just until they got back on their feet. But time had a way of folding in on itself when survival took the wheel. She never put her education on her employment forms. It raised too many questions. Instead, she studied in secret. Language was her only inheritance, the only part of her that still felt untouched by grief. At the hotel, she made herself small, efficient, invisible. She learned who to avoid, who to smile at, and who to pretend not to hear. She became fluent in silence, but her mind remained a storm of grammar drills, pronunciation exercises, and comparative linguistic theory. She taught herself structure again, through Spanish novels and Korean news broadcasts. It made her feel alive. But none of that mattered if it ever threatened her job. The world did not reward ambition in women like her. It punished it. So she hid. Lucas stared at the file again, unsatisfied. He had known liars. He had hired and fired manipulators who built false personas out of buzzwords and borrowed charm. Jada's silence wasn't the same. It wasn't fabricated. It was strategic. She hadn't tried to rise. She hadn't networked. She had simply buried her potential in work no one respected. That wasn't deception. That was survival. He clicked the intercom. "Cynthia, get me footage from the service lounge on Tuesday night. Time frame between 1:30 and 2 a.m. Later that day, he watched her on the screen, seated with her back straight, her voice flowing in Dutch over the phone. There was nothing showy about her, no attempt to impress anyone. It was a private moment. She didn't know anyone was listening. That made it all the more impressive. Lucas set down his pen and exhaled. He had to talk to her. Not through HR, not through filters or forms. Directly. He waited until the end of her next shift. She was leaving through the back entrance, duffel bag slung over her shoulder, when he stepped out of the shadow of the loading dock. "Miss West?" She startled, eyes wide, gripping her bag tighter. "I'm Lucas Sloan," he said, holding up a hand. "I own the Sloan Grand." "I know who you are," she said before she could stop herself. "I wanted to thank you. I saw how you helped the guests this week. German, French, Korean, Dutch. I was impressed." Her expression shifted slightly, cautious, guarded. "It was nothing. Just trying to help." "Helping isn't nothing," he replied. "Where did you learn all of those languages?" Jada hesitated. Her first instinct was to lie, to say something vague about high school electives or audio apps, but something about his tone stopped her. "I studied linguistics," she said slowly. "I didn't finish, but I still study, on my own." He nodded. "That much is obvious." She blinked. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you're being wasted in housekeeping." Jada's heart thudded in her chest. She took a step back. "If I've done something wrong—" "You haven't," he said firmly, "but I'm creating a new position, and I'd like to offer it to you." That was how it began. No one saw it coming. Not her, not the staff, not the managers who had walked past her for 3 years without so much as a greeting. But within 24 hours, Jada West would no longer be invisible, and the walls she had built so carefully would no longer be high enough to hide behind. The morning sun broke across San Francisco with an unusual softness, spilling golden light through the narrow cracks of the city's aging buildings. Inside her apartment, Jada stood frozen in her tiny kitchen, holding a spoonful of oatmeal that had long since cooled. Her phone buzzed again on the counter beside her, the screen displaying the same message for the 3rd time. "Please report to the Human Resources Office at 9 a.m. sharp. No explanation, no details, just a time and a location. From Lucas Sloan's assistant." Jada had barely slept since their conversation behind the hotel's loading dock. She had replayed it over and over in her mind. His voice, calm and deliberate, his words, impossible to forget. "I think you're being wasted in housekeeping." The sentence sat in her chest like a stone she didn't know how to lift. It wasn't just the offer that unsettled her, it was the simple, quiet truth of it. For years, she had accepted her position in the world as fixed, inevitable. Now, one man's attention threatened to shift everything she had built to keep herself safe. She had almost convinced herself it was a fluke, a misunderstanding, something he would forget by morning. But Lucas Sloan, it seemed, did not forget. At precisely 8:52, she stood outside the HR office on the 16th floor of the Sloan Grand, her hair neatly braided, her shoes polished, and her hands clenched tightly in front of her. She wore her best blouse, the one she'd saved for rare parent-teacher meetings or court appearances. Her knees trembled beneath her long skirt, but her spine was straight. The receptionist, a thin woman with crimson lipstick and unreadable eyes, gestured for her to enter without looking up. Inside, the office was quiet and cool. A sleek desk sat beneath a tall window that framed the city like a painting. Behind it, Valerie Green, Director of Human Resources, looked up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Miss West," she said crisply, "please sit." Jada obeyed, lowering herself into the plush leather chair like someone entering a courtroom. "I received a rather unusual request this morning," Mrs. Green began, folding her hands. "Mr. Sloan has asked that you be reassigned, effective immediately." Jada blinked. "Reassigned?" "Yes. To a newly created position within the International Guest Relations Department." The words meant nothing at first. They hovered in the air like foreign currency. Impressive but unfamiliar. "I don't understand," Jada said quietly. "What would I be doing?" "You'll be assisting high-profile guests, particularly those who do not speak English. You'll serve as a translator, a liaison, and a cultural advisor when needed. Mr. Sloan believes your skills are being underutilized." Jada's mouth went dry. How could he know?" "Apparently, he observed you speaking with several guests, in multiple languages. He was impressed." Mrs. Green arched a brow. "Frankly, so am I. Your file doesn't mention any language training." Jada dropped her gaze. "It didn't seem relevant at the time." "Well, it is now. The position comes with a full benefits package, flexible hours, and a salary approximately 3 times your current rate. We'll handle the training and onboarding this week. You'll begin shadowing immediately." The silence in the room stretched until it felt like it might snap. Jada couldn't speak. Her throat was tight, her lungs barely drawing breath. She had imagined different versions of her life so many times, returning to school, teaching abroad, joining a research team, but none of them had started here, like this. Thank you," she managed. Mrs. Green smiled again, this time with the faintest hint of warmth. "Don't thank me. Thank Mr. Sloan. He doesn't make impulsive decisions. He created this role for you." As Jada stepped out of the HR office and into the polished hallway, the world tilted under her feet. She was no longer heading for the service elevator, no longer clutching her cleaning tote. Instead, she walked past the golden elevators she had never dared ride, past the lobby where her presence had once been an afterthought. Everything looked the same. The velvet carpets, the crystal sconces, the subtle fragrance of white orchids in the air, but none of it felt familiar. That afternoon, she was led to a modest but elegant office on the 14th floor where a staff badge with a new title awaited her: Jada West, International Guest Relations Associate. Her uniform was gone, replaced by a soft navy skirt, a pale silk blouse, and low heels that felt strange beneath her feet. Her name tag shimmered in silver, clean and authoritative. She stared at it in the mirror of the restroom for several minutes before pinning it to her blouse. When she emerged, the receptionist gave her a quick tour of the guest suites, the executive lounge, and the translation room, a glass-walled space with access to a library of digital materials and real-time interpretation tools. Jada listened, nodded, asked polite questions, but her mind was distant, suspended somewhere between disbelief and dread. The news traveled faster than she expected. By the end of the day, the housekeeping staff had heard. Some sent her cautious congratulations. Others offered tight smiles that didn't match their eyes. A few avoided her entirely. That evening, in the break room where she had once eaten reheated leftovers in silence, she walked past a cluster of former colleagues who fell quiet as she entered. One of them, a senior housekeeper with 20 years at the hotel, muttered something under her breath. Jada caught only the words "fancy," "boss's favorite," and "not even qualified." She kept walking. Her back remained straight, her expression calm, but the words lodged in her chest like splinters. At home, Caleb hugged her around the waist when she told him the news. Mason cheered and did a little dance across the living room. Jada smiled and celebrated with them, letting them pick dinner and stay up an hour late. But when the apartment fell silent again, and she sat alone on the fire escape with a cup of tea, and the city sprawled out beneath her, the doubt crept in. She had not asked for this. She had not planned for this. And now she was standing on a platform that felt as unstable as it was breathtaking. The next morning, She was scheduled to shadow an assistant manager during a high-profile check-in with guests from Dubai. She arrived 10 minutes early, memorized the itinerary, and practiced greetings in Arabic under her breath. When the family arrived, she stepped forward with a warm smile and introduced herself in fluent, measured Arabic. The matriarch of the group lit up with surprise and delight. Jaida handled every request with grace, explaining spa protocols, confirming dietary preferences, and navigating a delicate moment involving a misplaced piece of luggage with tact and calm. After the guests were escorted to their suite, the assistant manager turned to her. "You sure you've never done this before?" Jada shook her head. "No, just studied a lot." "Mr. Sloan was right," the manager said, scribbling a note on his clipboard. "You've got something rare." The praise warmed her, but it also frightened her. Every compliment felt like a spotlight, and every spotlight felt like a trap. That afternoon, as she returned to her office to complete follow-up notes, her phone chimed with a new message. "Mr. Sloan would like to see you in his office at 4 p.m. She stared at the words for a long time. At 3:59, she stood outside his door, heart pounding. The receptionist waved her in without speaking. Lucas Sloan stood by the window, a coffee mug in hand, watching the fog roll across the bay. He turned when she entered and offered a faint smile. "You clean up well," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk. Jada sat, trying not to fidget. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like I woke up in someone else's life," she replied honestly. He chuckled, then nodded. "Maybe you're just waking up in your own." The conversation that followed was quiet, thoughtful. Lucas asked about her experience that morning, her comfort level, her long-term goals. He didn't interrupt. He didn't condescend. He simply listened. At the end of the meeting, he leaned back and said, "This isn't charity, Jida. I didn't promote you to make a point. I did it because I believe in talent. And because I'm tired of overlooking brilliance just because it doesn't come with a fancy pedigree." She nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. He watched her for a moment. "You belong here," he said. "Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." When she left his office, she didn't float, she didn't glow, but her steps were steadier. And for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. The week that followed was unlike anything Jada had ever experienced. From the moment she stepped into her new role, time began to accelerate, each day a whirlwind of new faces, languages, expectations, and the unspoken tension of navigating spaces where she had once been invisible. The days were long and meticulously scheduled. Every hour brought a new challenge, an ambassador from Argentina whose accent required sharp attention, a German couple requesting a private city tour, a Mandarin-speaking businesswoman who refused to engage unless she was addressed in her native language. And through it all, Jada performed. She translated not just words, but intentions. She adapted tones, facial expressions, and body language with an intuition that seemed to bypass conscious thought. Her former colleagues from housekeeping passed her in the corridors now with tentative glances. Some offered tight-lipped nods. Others simply turned away. She tried not to take it personally. People often resented what they could not explain, and nothing about her transformation made sense from the outside. By the third day, the name Jada West had started to circulate in upper management meetings, quietly but with curiosity. She was the topic of speculative whispers among directors who hadn't noticed her before. Some believed she was a new hire from out of state. Others assumed she was an executive's niece or a last-minute transfer from the corporate office. No one guessed she had spent the past 3 years wiping marble staircases beneath their polished shoes. Lucas Sloan, for his part, remained elusive. Since their meeting in his office, he had not summoned her again, but she often felt his presence like a pressure in the air. She would catch glimpses of him walking the halls, his expression unreadable, his focus always forward. He never lingered, never interfered, but she knew he was watching. On Thursday morning, she received a briefing packet that made her breath hitch in her chest. A delegation of Japanese investors would be arriving that afternoon, representatives of a firm considering a multi-million-dollar partnership with Sloan International to open a property in Tokyo. It was a high-stakes meeting, one with diplomatic implications, strict etiquette codes, and little room for error. She was assigned to interpret. It wasn't a request. It was a directive. She spent her lunch break in the library room, rereading formal Japanese expressions, reviewing the profiles of each investor, studying the cultural norms around introductions, seating order, honorifics. She remembered her professor's voice in her head. Language is more than grammar. It's rhythm, posture, breath. Her palms were damp. Her heart wouldn't settle. At 2 p.m., she walked into the conference suite on the 22nd floor. The room was exquisite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, a long walnut table polished to a mirror shine, delicate arrangements of white lilies and bamboo at each end. The air smelled faintly of green tea. Lucas was already there, dressed in a tailored dark gray suit, his posture relaxed but alert. He nodded at her as she entered, a flicker of reassurance in his eyes. Beside him sat the head of International Development, a woman named Simone Tran, who offered Yaida a brief smile but said little else. The delegation arrived at 2:15 precisely. 6 men in dark suits entered in near silence, their movements fluid and synchronized. Yaida bowed at the correct angle, greeted them in Japanese with a respectful tone, and watched their faces shift with surprise and approval. One of the men, an elder statesman with silver hair and a calm demeanor, acknowledged her directly. The meeting began. Yaida stood beside Lucas, translating with precision and grace. Her voice flowed in rhythm with the room, never intrusive, always adapting. When the conversation became technical, she adjusted her vocabulary. When the tone turned philosophical, she softened her cadence. When questions arose about American hospitality standards, she clarified without defensiveness, offering cultural bridges rather than defenses. Midway through the discussion, one of the investors posed a question directly to Lucas in Japanese. A subtle test Yaida recognized of whether the CEO understood more than he let on. Before Lucas could answer, she stepped in gently, explaining the nuance of the phrase, how it implied not just curiosity but a challenge to intent. The elder statesman smiled slightly and nodded. Lucas glanced at her, his expression unreadable, but his next response was perfectly measured. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. The investors were relaxed, even warm. Handshakes were exchanged, small bows followed. As they left, one of them said in Japanese, "Your interpreter understands more than language. She understands us." When the door closed behind them, Simone Tran turned to Yaida and simply said, "Well done." Lucas waited until they were alone. "You saved the entire deal," he said softly. Yaida could only stare at him. "I didn't think I could do it." "I did," he said. "I saw it the moment I heard you speaking Dutch in the break room like it was the most natural thing in the world." There was a long pause. His voice dropped a degree, barely audible. "I have a place I go when I need to clear my head. Would you come with me tonight?" She blinked. "You mean Like, no expectations, he interrupted, just two people talking. Jada hesitated. The idea terrified her. It felt dangerous, not because she feared him, but because she didn't. There was something in the way he looked at her that bypassed the usual hierarchy, the usual male gazes she'd learned to dodge. He didn't pity her. He didn't study her like a problem to be solved. He saw her. And that, somehow, was the most disarming thing of all. She found herself nodding. That evening, after the shift change, a sleek black car picked her up from the hotel's side entrance. The driver said nothing, only held the door and offered her water as they drove through the city. The streets gave way to winding roads that climbed into the hills, past the noise and traffic, until they reached a quiet overlook perched above the skyline. Lucas was waiting there, standing beside a simple wooden bench in a rooftop garden surrounded by wild herbs and native grasses. The city glowed below, a sea of lights against the darkness. "This is beautiful," Jada said softly as she approached. "I come here when I need to remember who I am," he replied, "or to figure out who I'm becoming." They sat. The wind tugged at the edge of her jacket. He handed her a paper cup filled with warm wine, the kind served at European cafes. Simple, honest. They talked. About everything. Lucas told her about growing up with a single father who worked night janitor shifts at motels across the Midwest. About how he had once cleaned toilets in hotels not unlike the Sloan Grand. About how he built his empire brick by brick, driven not by ego, but by the aching desire to make something lasting. She told him about her parents, about the photo of her mother taped to the mirror above her bed, about the nights she studied with a flashlight so the boys wouldn't wake, about the moments she thought she'd never make it past 25. They didn't touch, they didn't flirt, but the space between them grew warmer, charged with something deeper than physical attraction, recognition. At one point, Lucas turned to her, his voice lower than before. "I've made deals that earned millions, but none of them made me feel the way I felt watching you in that room today." She swallowed, not trusting her voice. "I don't know what this is," he continued, gesturing between them, "but it's real. It's honest. And I haven't had a lot of that in my life." Jada met his eyes. "Neither have I." They sat in silence as the wind moved through the garden. When he finally drove her home, they said little. He didn't walk her to the door. He didn't ask for anything more. But as she stood in the elevator of her apartment building, heart pounding in the hush, she knew something irreversible had begun. She wasn't just changing roles. She was changing futures. And the edge she now stood on was no longer about fear. It was about possibility. Rumors moved like smoke through the corridors of the Sloan Grand, invisible but thick enough to alter the air. They passed from mouth to mouth in break rooms, drifted between servers in the staff elevator, and wrapped themselves around half-truths and resentments like ivy climbing the edges of crumbling walls. Jada heard them in fragments, muted laughter behind her back, whispers that stopped when she entered a room, the occasional stare held just a little too long. She tried to ignore it. Her focus stayed on her work, which had only grown more demanding since the Japanese delegation's visit. New tasks flooded her inbox daily. She coordinated translation materials, scheduled multilingual tours, helped refine cultural protocols for guests from 7 different countries in 1 week. Her mind was constantly engaged, spinning like a well-oiled machine. But that didn't stop the murmurs. The story that gained the most traction was that Lucas Sloan had discovered Jada for reasons that had nothing to do with language. Some said he was grooming her. Others whispered that she was ambitious in ways that had little to do with skill. The language was veiled, always just shy of actionable. But the implication was clear. She didn't belong. She hadn't earned this. The first time Jada heard it openly was during a quiet moment in the executive lounge. She'd come in early to prepare for a high-level briefing with an embassy delegate from Morocco. She was reviewing her notes when two assistant managers entered, unaware she was behind the frosted partition wall. "I don't care how many languages she speaks," one of them said, voice sharp. "Nobody gets promoted that fast unless they're sleeping with someone." "Especially someone like her," the other replied. "From housekeeping to international strategy. Please." He probably likes her little accent games. Makes him feel cultured. Jada didn't move, didn't breathe. She waited until they left, then stood, adjusted her blouse, and walked out the door with her spine rigid and her hands trembling. That night, she didn't tell Caleb or Mason what happened. She helped with homework, cooked dinner, and smiled through the ache building in her chest. When they were asleep, she sat on the fire escape and stared out over the city, her notebook open on her knees but untouched. She no longer doubted her ability. What she doubted now was whether the world would ever let her win without trying to stain the victory. Lucas noticed the shift almost immediately. She was still sharp, still diligent, but something behind her eyes had changed. A guard had returned, one he thought he had seen drop that night in the garden. When he called her in for a private check-in, she entered the room with her shoulders tight and her tone carefully professional. "Is something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, everything's fine." But he knew better. "Talk to me, Jada. Please." She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Do you know what they're saying about me?" Lucas's expression didn't change. "I've heard things." "And you didn't think to say anything?" "If I addressed every lie whispered about me or the people I promote," he said, "I wouldn't have time to run a business." "But this is different," she said, her voice low. "They're not just questioning your judgment. They're questioning my integrity, my worth. And the people doing it have power here." Lucas stood, walked around the desk, and leaned against the edge in front of her. "Do you want to know the first lesson my father ever taught me about success?" She didn't answer. "When you rise from a place people believe you should have stayed in, they'll try to pull you back. Not because they want the place, but because your rise challenges their sense of order. That doesn't make it right." "No," he agreed, "but it makes it inevitable." She looked away. "I worked so hard to be taken seriously." "I know," he said, "and you are, by the people who matter. That's not always enough." "Maybe not," Lucas said, "but I promise you this, no one here gets to rewrite your story, not while I'm standing." She wanted to believe him, but belief, she'd learned, was a fragile thing. It needed proof. The next week tested every part of her. An internal reception was held for Sloan International's board of directors, some of whom flew in from London, Dubai, and Sao Paulo. Jada was tasked with managing hospitality for the visiting teams, coordinating greetings, menus, and private tour arrangements. Everything had to be perfect. 3 days before the event, a man named Garrett Price was added to the planning committee. He was a senior executive, mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, known for his bluntness and disdain for anything that disrupted the old ways. He greeted Jada with a smile too tight and a handshake too firm. "You're the famous polyglot," he said, "quite the rise. You must be very talented." The pause before the last word carried enough implication to curdle milk. Jada nodded, said nothing, and continued her preparations. At the final planning session, Garrett handed her a set of documents just before the review. "Last-minute additions," he said. "Translate for the Mandarin-speaking guests, please." Jada flipped through the papers and felt her stomach twist. The documents weren't in Mandarin. They were in simplified Chinese mixed with Cantonese idioms and outdated terminology that hadn't been used in decades. It was a mess, either a mistake or a setup. She looked up at him. He was smiling. "I'll need a few minutes," she said coolly, and walked out of the room. She sat in the resource center, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She reconstructed the content, rephrased the entire document into proper Mandarin, double-checked the cultural sensitivity of each phrase, and printed new copies. It took her 18 minutes. When she returned, she placed both the original and revised versions on the table in front of the planning team. "I corrected the documents," she said evenly. "The originals included inappropriate language for this region's dialect group. If I had used them, it could have offended the guests." Garrett opened his mouth, but Lucas, who had entered the room during her absence, spoke first. "Thank you, Jada," he said, his tone cold. "We'll make sure your version is used." He turned to Garrett. "And I'll want to know how that document ended up in her hands." Garrett paled. The incident was never officially addressed, but Jada noticed a change. The whispers lessened. The stares faded. Some of the staff even started coming to her with small questions, requests for translation help, etiquette guidance, cultural insight. Slowly, her presence became normalized, respected even. That Friday, after the reception ended and the guests had departed, Lucas asked her to walk with him. They strolled through the now empty ballroom, the floors still gleaming from fresh polish. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I knew this would be hard, but I underestimated just how much people would fight to keep the old order intact." "I don't need an apology," she said. "I need consistency." "You'll have it," he promised. "From me." They stood together in silence, watching the chandeliers reflect the soft light above them. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Taking this role?" "No," he said. "Being seen." She thought about it for a moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not enough to stop." Lucas smiled. "That's all I needed to hear." As they parted ways that night, Jada felt something shift, not just around her, but within her. The doubt remained. So did the fear. But they no longer ruled her. She had survived sabotage. She had stood her ground. And she was still rising. The storm outside began as a whisper, a low murmur of wind sweeping across the San Francisco Bay. Rain splashed against the wide glass windows of the Sloan Grand as if nature herself was trying to scrub the city clean. Inside, in a quiet corner office with warm light and books stacked in corners, Jada West was staring down at her tablet, scrolling through a schedule so full it looked like it belonged to a cabinet minister, not a woman who had scrubbed baseboards for 3 years. Her eyes flicked across names and countries. A South African envoy, a French tech mogul, a South Korean television delegation, all arriving within 72 hours. Her new normal no longer surprised her, but it still hadn't settled into comfort. She had learned to navigate these rooms with grace, to read expressions and power dynamics like an ancient map. But a part of her still checked over her shoulder for the past. She carried it like a second shadow, quieter now, but still breathing behind her. The incident with Garrett Price had changed more than the internal perception of her. It had altered her relationship with herself. She had always believed that excellence would be enough to protect her, that if she worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, no one would try to harm her. But the lie of that belief had cracked, and in the broken pieces she found a harder, brighter truth. She didn't need to hide to be safe. She needed to stand to be free. Lucas had kept his promise. Since that day in the ballroom, he had drawn a quiet but firm line between Jaida and anyone who dared diminish her worth. She was no longer a curiosity. She was an authority. She had a seat at the table, not just because he gave her one, but because she had earned it 100 times over. Still, the line between them remained unspoken. Their conversations were frequent now, always charged with something just beneath the surface. After every meeting, every late-night debrief, every passing moment in the hallway, Jaida left with her thoughts tangled, her pulse slightly too fast. Lucas never crossed a boundary, never used his power to pull her closer, but his presence lingered around her like a question neither of them was brave enough to answer, until one quiet Sunday. The hotel had closed off the rooftop lounge for repairs, and the city below was half asleep beneath a steady downpour. Jaida was reviewing updated contracts in the small satellite office off the executive floor when Lucas's voice came softly through the open doorway. "Still working?" She looked up. He stood there without a jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the sharp line of his forearms, his hair damp from the rain. "Some of us don't have empires to run," she said lightly, her lips curving despite herself. He stepped inside and leaned against the frame. "I know this is last minute, but I was going to cook tonight. I make a halfway decent risotto. I thought you might join me." Her fingers froze on the screen. He had never invited her anywhere outside the hotel grounds. Not once. Not even during the late-night chats in the garden or brief walks between meetings. This was different. Personal. She hesitated, then heard herself say yes. His home was nothing like she expected. It wasn't a mansion on a hill or a sterile penthouse with black leather and chrome. It was a craftsman-style house tucked into a tree-lined street near Coal Valley, warm and lived in, with books everywhere and soft rugs beneath bare wooden floors. The fireplace crackled gently. A golden retriever wandered up and sniffed her hand. "I didn't know you had a dog," she said, kneeling to scratch behind his ears. "Neither did I," Lucas said. "He adopted me 2 years ago, showed up on my porch during a thunderstorm and refused to leave. I like him already." They cooked together, standing shoulder to shoulder in the narrow kitchen. Lucas chopped garlic with surprising precision. Jaida stirred broth into the rice while describing the linguistic roots of Basque dialects. He listened, fascinated, asking questions that told her he was paying attention, not just to the language, but to her. After dinner, they moved to the living room, wine glasses in hand, and fell into conversation so natural it frightened her. He told her about his father again, about the long nights cleaning diners and saving tips in a mason jar for a dream he'd never lived to see. She told him about her mother's hands, how they smelled like orange soap and cocoa butter, how she used to hum while folding laundry as if every wrinkle was a song. The rain fell harder. Thunder rolled in the distance, and then silence. Jaida looked at him. "Why me?" Lucas turned to her slowly. "What do you mean? You could have chosen anyone, promoted anyone, someone easier, safer, someone who wouldn't make people whisper." His gaze didn't waver. "Because when I heard you speak that day in the break room, I realized something. I'd built an empire filled with people who looked right on paper but said nothing that mattered. You mattered. You still do." Her breath caught. "I'm afraid." "So am I," he said quietly. She looked away. "If people find out, About this, about us, they'll say it's the only reason I got where I am." "Then let them talk," he said. "We'll keep walking." She turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And if I fall, I'll be right there," he said. "Every step, not to catch you, to walk beside you." The moment between them stretched, delicate, charged, sacred. He didn't kiss her, but she took his hand, and it was more honest than anything she had felt in years. After that night, something shifted again, but this time not in fear. They didn't announce anything. They didn't need to. They continued as they always had, collaborating on projects, solving diplomatic challenges, mentoring younger staff together. But those who watched closely saw it. The way they glanced at each other during briefings, the way Jaida's voice softened slightly when she greeted him, the quiet gravity of his presence when she entered a room. For the first time, she no longer questioned her place. She was seen, she was respected, and maybe, just maybe, she was loved. 2 weeks later, a call came from the European Expansion Division. An opportunity had opened in Amsterdam. Sloan International was preparing to open its first Dutch property, and Lucas wanted Jada to lead the cross-cultural integration team. "You'll be building the guest experience from the ground up," he said, sliding the file across the table. "Language services, staff training, international protocol, everything." Her hands trembled as she held the proposal. "Why me?" "You speak the language," he said, "and because there's no one else I trust more to represent what we're becoming." She exhaled slowly. "Will you be there?" "I'll be wherever you are." She said yes. The fear didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled her. She had climbed from the bottom rung with grace and grit and brilliance so fierce it burned through the fog of doubt. Now, at the edge of everything she once thought impossible, she took her next step. Not with trembling, but with purpose. The cold air in Amsterdam had a different weight than San Francisco's breezes. Sharper, more direct, like it had no patience for indecision. As Jada stood on the stone terrace of the newly opened Sloan Amsterdam Hotel, she felt it in her lungs, clean and biting. Below her, the city unfurled in a network of canals and soft-colored rooftops, the bells of a nearby tram ringing faintly as it rattled past. The wind swept through her coat, tugging at the silk scarf knotted at her neck, a gift from Lucas on their first night in the city. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound and wind anchor her, and tried to make sense of how far she had come. It had been 6 months since she had accepted the offer to lead Sloan's expansion into Europe, and in that time her life had accelerated into a version of itself she once thought belonged to someone else. Not a day passed without challenge. She navigated complex negotiations, hired and trained a multilingual staff, worked late into the night on cultural integration guides, and translated not just language but mindset, building bridges between Western hospitality expectations and the deep traditions of Dutch, Belgian, and French guest culture. She was no longer interpreting for someone else. She was creating the strategy, setting the tone, deciding the standard. Her new title, Director of International Strategy, was embossed in gold letters on her office door. Her name, once ignored or mispronounced or left off schedules, now appeared in press releases, trade reports, and internal memos that reached executive desks across 4 continents. But it wasn't the title or the attention that humbled her. It was the subtle shift she noticed in herself, how she now walked into rooms without shrinking, how she spoke without softening her intelligence, how she no longer apologized for being everything they hadn't expected. Lucas had kept his word. He had flown to Amsterdam twice during construction and once more for the grand opening, where they stood together on a raised stage beside the hotel's glass entrance as cameras flashed and dignitaries from across the EU applauded. It was the first time he had introduced her publicly, not just as a director, but as the woman he was building a future with. The reaction was immediate. Media outlets speculated. Business blogs buzzed. Some lauded his decision. Others murmured disapproval behind polished smiles. But the rumors faded quickly under the weight of the one thing no one could dispute: Jaida's brilliance. Her work spoke for itself. The guests felt it from the moment they arrived, every detail curated with care, every interaction layered with nuance, every language barrier gently removed. The staff felt it too. Her leadership was steady and precise, but always personal. She asked questions. She listened. She made them feel seen. In the evenings, when the meetings ended and the city slowed, she and Lucas would retreat to a quiet apartment overlooking the Prinsengracht Canal. It wasn't luxurious by billionaire standards, but it was theirs. Warm wood floors, bookshelves full of Dutch novels and language texts, a stovetop where she made tea with cardamom the way her mother used to. Lucas would cook, usually simple things: soup, pasta, grilled vegetables, and they'd eat on the couch, their feet tangled beneath a blanket, their conversation drifting from global logistics to childhood dreams. They rarely spoke about the past anymore. It wasn't avoidance, it was evolution. They had carried their scars into the present, but they no longer defined them. She had stopped measuring her value by the shadows she escaped. Now she measured it by the spaces she shaped. The memory of the hotel basement, of grimy uniforms and silence and whispers, had not vanished. But it no longer carried shame. It was a monument now, something she could look back on not with bitterness, but with clarity. That woman, silent, invisible, had survived. And she had done more than that. She had transformed. Word of her journey began to circulate beyond the hospitality industry. University deans in the United States requested interviews. International language symposiums extended keynote invitations. A foundation in the Netherlands asked her to mentor refugee girls studying translation and diplomacy. And on a stormy afternoon in October, she received a letter from the Chancellor of the University of Southern California, where her transcript had once gone cold and unfinished. They were offering her an honorary degree in applied linguistics. When she read the letter, her hands shook. She sat alone in her office for a long time, the weight of that moment pressing against every bone in her body, not because she needed the degree to validate her, but because it marked the circle she had unknowingly completed. What had once ended in silence had found its voice again. Later that evening, she told Lucas, who only smiled and said, "I hope they know they're 5 years late." She laughed, and for the first time in days, let herself cry. Months passed. The Amsterdam location flourished under her direction. Guest satisfaction metrics soared. Revenue exceeded projections. Jaida remained at the helm, but now also advised on expansions in Cape Town and Singapore, traveling between cities as a strategist and liaison. She had become a living emblem of what Sloan International claimed to stand for: inclusion, precision, and innovation born from unlikely brilliance. One day, while passing through the lobby on her way to a meeting, she noticed a young woman polishing the brass handles of the main entrance. The girl couldn't have been more than 19. Her uniform was oversized, her shoes slightly scuffed, but her eyes were alert, her movements careful. Jaida paused. "Is this your first week?" she asked. The girl straightened. "Yes, ma'am." Jaida smiled. "You're doing good work. Don't ever think nobody sees it." The girl nodded, stunned, as Jada turned and walked on. That night, she returned to the apartment early. Lucas was reading on the couch, a dog-eared novel in his lap and a glass of wine in hand. He looked up when she entered. "You're home," he said. "Yeah," she said, kicking off her heels and dropping her bag on the chair. "I needed a night to remember who I am." He tilted his head. "And who's that?" She sat beside him, curled her legs underneath her, and rested her head on his shoulder. A woman who's no longer invisible. Outside, the canals shimmered beneath the moonlight. The city exhaled. And Jada West, once a silent shadow in the back halls of a hotel, now stood at the helm of her own future. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she took it. With language, with dignity, and with the kind of courage that transforms not only rooms, but lives. She had never been a guest in this world. She had been building it the whole time. Subscribe for more stories like this. Watch the next video to see what happens next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it.